this plenary because this network is a network that I've been doing things with for quite a long time. I think in the last 20 years I've only missed 3 Easter conferences, so I'm kind of quite used to the system. But I also look forward to reading the abstracts that people in this network come forward, because I often find them more interesting and more innovative than the ones from more experienced researchers. So although not everyone looks forward to looking at abstracts, I always look forward to that because I learn so much from what you're doing. And then of course it's been especially good this year because I've been able to go to quite a few of the sessions and listen to the fantastic work that you're doing. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is diversity in doctoral education. It's actually quite a complicated topic, and it's also, I think, for some people, quite a controversial topic. I'm not really producing a kind of how to make things better. What I'm looking at is some of the issues that perhaps don't always get looked at when people talk about this. So that's the plan. So I've talked about it being a dream or reality because people often say, oh, well, when you do this, or, you know, when you make all your candidates for doctoral research diverse, then that's it, you've achieved it. And one of the things I'm going to say is that absolutely you haven't, because there's an awful lot of other things that need to be in place at the same time. So the aim is to look at what are the kind of particular issues in relation to European doctoral education in particular, although of course it applies to other doctoral education too. But even in organisations that are really committed to diversity, it's still often quite difficult for them to do what they want to do, and there may be all sorts of obstacles and tensions that come in the way. And changes to doctoral education can also have hidden pitfalls. And I think that's shown in a Nordic country study of doctoral program changes, which shows that you can make some wonderful innovations, but unless everybody understands how they work, and unless everyone is supported, then actually all you've done is introduce more chaos rather than something that is kind of new and exciting. So the main themes are, why does diversity matter for doctoral education? How does it relate to inclusivity, because that's also important, and particularly around universal design. And then I'll give some examples of particularly important and sometimes neglected diversity matters, and then I'll say something about what the challenges are. So how diverse is doctoral education in Europe? Is it a reality already? To some extent, in terms of women and men, I think that there has been a lot of progress. And you can see that from SHE figures in 2021, right across Europe. But the European data and literature on doctoral researchers and ethnicity, race, minority groups, underrepresented groups, neurodiversity, disabilities, that isn't so good. So there's still actually a lot more to do. And that, of course, makes it particularly challenging because those things are quite different, and what makes a difference with one doesn't necessarily help the other. And people may also experience multiple disadvantages, so we have to take intersectionality into account at the same time. And there isn't very much Europe-wide data on the extent of diversity in the content of theses, for example. So we don't really know kind of very much about that. And also there's so many complicated factors, so, you know, the discipline, the kind of thesis it is it a monograph, is it published papers, the knowledge base, the language it's written in. But also, there's very little that I can find that actually talks about doctoral supervisors and how diverse they are. So we've got stuff on academics, but not on supervisors, and not all academics supervise. And the global north domination of content and knowledge is clearly already a concern, but the decolonization of doctoral education, I think, is still a long way behind, partly because it's more individualistic. So whereas with an undergraduate class or a course, you can actually do something to the curriculum and buy new resources. That's much more difficult to do for doctoral education because people will need a whole range of different sources and will be doing different things. So why does it matter? I mean, firstly, I think it provides a much livelier kind of atmosphere in which to do research. It offers an intercultural and hopefully multilingual context for doctoral researchers to work within, which is important. Without that diversity, we risk losing valuable future research potential, which is one thing people often forget about when they say, we really just want to pick the people that we know already from the elite institutions who've already shown that they're brilliant. We don't want to look at anybody else. And if we do that, we lose an awful lot of potential research. The diversity of candidates and forms of knowledge extends the boundaries of thesis knowledge, and that's important too. Diversity is more likely to produce research that has a real-world impact, and you can see that in some of the work that Susan Porter's done in Canada, where she's actually set up a kind of real-world 2 years expedition where those candidates that get funding actually have to be able to talk to the public and talk to the people who would be interested in the use of their research in a much more sophisticated way than you would normally do in a doctorate. And also because diversity is an important step on the way to inclusivity. This is just a kind of quote from Georgiou and Haskell from the European University Association Council for Doctoral Education, also saying about why diversity in doctoral education matters. I won't read it all out because it will take too long, but I think what they're saying is that this is important, but remember that it isn't straightforward because sometimes people may discover tensions and problems. They may be worried about becoming an academic because it's quite often quite precarious. And if you come from a background that you don't have much money in your family, then that's going to be an issue. So it's not a straightforward process at all. Eli and Thomas talk about, not in universities, in different organisations, but what makes cultural diversity successful. And they looked at 3 different organisations which were culturally diverse already, with a view to seeing why does this work and make everything much better, and why does it not work? And they looked at different perspectives. So they looked at integration and learning, they looked at access and legitimacy, and they looked at discrimination and fairness. These were categories that were raised by the people that they worked with. And they found that the most effective one was the integration and learning one, and that the others didn't convince people in the same way. So even the way that you actually achieve your diversity is quite important, and that makes a difference to whether it's going to be credible or not, or whether it's just going to cause a lot of tensions. So that is also another element. So why is it so difficult to achieve doctoral diversity? So a recent EUA CDE survey found that equality was high up in institutional priorities. This was sending it out to its members. And that 35% of respondents HEI saw it as very high priority, and then a much bigger group saw it as a high priority. However, when the respondents were asked themselves what their own priorities were, only 11% gave equality as important for doctoral education, with quality of supervision coming top and doctoral funding coming second. So that's part of the problem, is that people are committed to equality, but if other things they think are more important come along, then they will tend to choose those, and they will spend their money and time on that, not on improving doctoral diversity. And also in some countries, not necessarily that many in Europe, but there are some, diversity and inclusion go against the kind of right-wing politics that exists in their political systems. So that's another problem too. So how important is it that whilst we're doing the kind of efforts around diversity, that we also talk about inclusivity? So inclusivity in the universities is becoming a big issue, but I'm not sure if it's becoming a big issue or a big enough issue in terms of doctoral education. If we only focus on diversity, there's a danger that simply admitting a diverse cohort to a doctoral program does not achieve very much unless you also make sure that everything else that you do in that program has also been changed. Otherwise, what it effectively says is, we're going to take you on an exciting journey. We've bought you a car. Oh, by the way, the car doesn't come with any wheels or a steering wheel. So you won't be able to go very far, but you'll be able to practice being part of this community. And also, inclusivity needs to start a long time before you actually recruit people. Because one of the things that we do know is that a lot of people from disadvantaged backgrounds, people of colour, people with disabilities, they actually don't really understand exactly, and they're not the only ones, because lots of the other candidates don't either, really understand what it is to do a doctoral degree. And actually having open workshops where you make this available for your university can be really powerful, because if it's free and if it's online as well as face-to-face, then that allows everybody to get a chance to understand more about what they're doing, which is good for doctoral education in general as well. It's not just about inclusivity. But we also know that we've known for a long time that just recruiting international students doesn't necessarily make your institution brilliant at diversity. And I'm kind of quite shocked that this is an article that I wrote with my husband, who sadly died 10 years ago, about international doctoral researchers in 2 education departments in 2 UK institutions. And what we did was talk to them about the social experience they had, particularly in their first year when they arrived. And many of them said things like, well, nobody talks to us. If we go to some kind of social event, we're just put in the corner. Nobody's interested in us. The UK students all gather together and they know each other and they're not interested in us. But what I'm shocked about is that article is more than 20 years old, but it is still apparently, according to the journal, being quoted and cited. And I think that's because nobody else as much has looked at it, which is astounding, because something that was an issue 20 years ago is still an issue now. And a member survey by EUA Council for Doctoral Education found 66% of doctoral researchers complete their thesis within 6 years. And I think about 50% of the respondents said that had been stable for quite a while. But that's still quite a high percentage that are either not completing at all or who are completing very late. And that typically will include exactly those people that you've brought into your programs in order to widen diversity. So that's why inclusivity is important, because unless you do that extra step, nothing much is going to change. I'm fascinated by this. So some of you may know about this already, but there's something called universal design for learning. I think there's been papers on that during the conference. And it's originally started, I think, in architecture, about spaces and how you make spaces available to different users and how you have accessible learning spaces. So it was really originally something that was applied to students with disabilities, not necessarily doctoral researchers, but undergraduate students, for example, and master's students. But now it's been extended quite a lot to other characteristics beyond disability, so gender, race, ethnicity, social class, etc. But what it in theory allows, in a broad application, is it allows inclusive and flexible learning to take place, subject to changes in the kind of way that you assess people, so that the whole thing becomes more permeable and also might have more variety, but as long as the outcomes are the same, that doesn't matter. But what I find fascinating, I can't find almost anything where people actually talk about universal design for learning in relation to doctoral education, which seems a pity, because that seems to me that, of course, it is more difficult, because, as I say, you're dealing with individual supervisors, individual doctoral researchers. But unless we do, it seems to me we're missing a really important opportunity. I'm now going to move on to kind of examples of doctoral diversity issues. So I'm not going to go through all of them, because that would take me far too long and you'd be bored and you want to go outside and look at the sunshine. Did we mention sunshine? Maybe this is Glasgow, yes. We'll come back to that later. Now, I think this issue about neurodivergence and neurodiversity is important, not because it's particularly new. I think the concept has been around quite a few decades. And it covers a lot of different conditions, so everything from autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, and so on, come under that heading. And obviously, they can provide quite a lot of challenges for doctoral researchers who have those conditions. And it might be writing chapters, it might be engaging in seminars, it might be being in particular kinds of spaces, But the conditions, of course, themselves, if you make those doctoral researchers who have them feel somehow that they're different and have to be kind of categorized in a particular way, then it makes the whole thing more problematic. But what I find interesting is that some higher education institutions in Europe, I think probably not all that many, have all sorts of regulations, assessment, guidance and so on, help for supervisors, so that if you get a doctoral researcher who has one of these conditions, you get some sense of what you should do and not do. And I think sometimes those things are quite surprising. So I had a dyslexic student who finished a PhD with me a year ago in this September, and he managed really, really well. But one thing that he did do, which I hadn't really thought of, is that he found it really difficult when I and his other supervisor said, could you possibly just rewrite, page 6 to 8? He had to write the whole chapter again, because he found it really difficult to separate out the bits that we wanted him to rewrite. So every time we asked him to rewrite, he would rewrite the whole chapter. And that was something I'd not even thought about. So there are lots of things that happen that we kind of don't even think about that make it more difficult for those students. I think also this is an interesting kind of quote from Inga Muban, who has a blog which is aimed at doctoral researchers. And she says that she thinks there are a lot of people who, for example, may be on the autism spectrum in universities, but they don't actually tell anyone because they're terrified that people will then not want them to be there, whether they're doctoral researchers, whether they're undergraduates, whether they're academics, and that some of the things they have are things like sensory issues around lights. They might have trouble sitting still, they might not be able to be in certain kinds of rooms. So there's a whole set of things there that need looking at. But what she says is it's mostly hidden. So there is neurodiversity, but nobody really knows it's there, and that of course means there's no support. A second issue, I think, has been researched quite a lot, and that's mental health and well-being. But I'm not really convinced that that much has happened. So there's a lot of talk about it and how important it is. Quite a few people giving really good papers at this conference about it. But I think that one of the problems is that obviously, supervisors are not expert at dealing with things like this. So it's not that supervisors are expected to become kind of counsellors or to kind of know about how to help people. But what they ought to be able to do is know where to refer people to give them a choice, because not everybody wants to be referred to counselling, say, within a university. They might prefer to go somewhere more anonymous. That if we look at what happened in the COVID pandemic, then there's also quite a lot of mention of mental health problems there. I think there's a sense in which mental health and well-being get muddled up together as though they're the same thing, but they're not the same thing at all. I mean, well-being is about how you live, but mental health, if it's a real problem, is something that obviously needs to be taken very seriously. And I worry that we're developing a climate in which doctoral researchers, when they come into doctoral education, are given the impression that it's going to be awful. They're going to be depressed, they're going to be anxious, they're bound to suffer crises. Now, of course, everybody feels anxious from time to time, but we had an interesting talk a few years ago to our doctoral school supervisors about, from somebody from a mental health charity, and she said you have to kind of normalise the fact that people do feel depressed from time to time or feel anxious about things and worry about them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to become mentally ill. So I think we have to kind of try not, whilst we need to give a lot more support, I think we also need to remember that actually if you make it too dramatic, then people think that's the norm. I mean, I don't know how many of you know the Facebook page about, reviewer must be got rid of. I think that's probably not quite its title, but this has an awful lot of doctoral researchers on it, and it's actually quite worrying how much people are relying on asking strangers about how to conduct their doctoral research, which does suggest that there's a lot of unfulfilled kind of capacity for doing a lot more for doctoral researchers than we do. So I think mental health is really important, and so is well-being, but I think we have to kind of be aware that we have to be careful not to create this notion that somehow this is the norm, that everybody's going to get into a really difficult situation, they're going to have a miserable time, because that isn't what happens to the majority of people. It does happen to some people, but hopefully not everybody. The next issue, which I think doesn't get enough attention, is really about supervisors and what is their role in diversity and inclusion. And I mean, obviously there are several elements of supervision that are relevant, including having supervisors from diverse backgrounds. I have to say, I think that's a lot harder to achieve than it is to achieve a broad range of candidates, because firstly, there aren't that many openings in some systems. Some systems, there might be kind of one permanent job comes up about every 5 years or 10 years or something like that. So it's not that easy to change your staff. And if you can't change them, then you have to find some way of supporting them and improving their capacity to actually deal with diverse students. But there's also, I think, the kind of notion of having skills in dealing with students from different cultures, from different language backgrounds, from different environments in terms of what they did in their previous degrees. And I think that's something that doesn't always happen. But of course, presenting a diverse and inclusive curriculum in doctoral education, you can try and do it in terms of transferable skills, you can try and do it in terms of methods, including the examples that you use. But it is still quite hard, because much of the curriculum is informal and comes from the supervision process. So it's not very easily monitored, and we don't always know what's going on. I mean, a 2021 survey of UK supervisors, quite a large number, 3,500, found a third thought that they didn't have enough support on dealing with diversity, but quite a lot of them thought they had the intercultural skills to supervise diverse doctoral researchers. However, a much lower percentage had actually recently supervised somebody in that category. So they thought they had a skill, which maybe they didn't have, or they didn't have it to the same extent that they imagined, because they hadn't tried it out in recent times. I think one thing that might help is that collective supervision in Europe is on the increase, and so the notion of having more than one supervisor. Now, of course, that can cause problems too, but it does have the advantage that they may have a different approach, and as long as they keep in touch with each other, then that actually is quite a positive thing, but it doesn't happen everywhere. So that's not really a kind of universal answer. So another example is doctoral careers. Now, again, you may think, oh, well, yes, people are writing about that, but it's not relevant to diversity. But I think it is, because firstly, we know that actually doctoral researchers do have higher rates of employment. But what we don't know so much about, when they're not going to follow an academic career, which in some countries only about 5% of doctoral candidates will ever actually get a permanent academic job, so the rest will be in precarious jobs. What we don't know is what those other people do, because often those people who deal with alumni are not very interested in doctoral research, because apparently they never leave any money to the university, so they don't bother to pay much attention to them. So there is a whole issue around that. I mean, some commentators, particularly economists, sorry if you're an economist, anybody, say that doctoral expansion leads to over-education. I have no concept of what over-education is. I remember once giving a discussion about this at a graduate ceremony when I was at Lancaster, and saying, you know, do you feel over-educated? Put your hands up if you feel over-educated. We'll take some away when you go. But there is this kind of notion that if you don't send people into academic jobs, then that's a problem. And of course, in some countries, the doctorate is not recognised, even in professional fields. So that is a problem that some countries have got. Not all countries have got that. But there are massive differences in the percentage who actually enter academic posts. But for those from disadvantaged or underrepresented groups, the last thing they want at the end of a doctorate is to end up with a precarious job, which could go on for years. And some systems, after a certain period of time, they don't employ you anymore at all. But in others, you just carry on having, often maybe 2 or 3 jobs, which you kind of you don't particularly want those number of jobs, but it's the only way to keep going. And I think that it's actually quite hard to get European-wide data on employment outside of academia. There's lots of good studies now, but often they're quite small, even if they're going across different countries. And so we could do with a lot more information on that, because if you know what the different things are that people might go into, then that helps quite a lot. Another example is this question of diverse knowledge. So obviously there are massive differences in the disciplines in relation to what kind of knowledge is valued. And I think knowledge diversity is probably much easier to establish in some disciplines than others. I think it's probably very hard in science, not quite so hard in the humanities, but still challenging. And some countries have embraced indigenous knowledge in HE context. I think that's less so in Europe because of the different kind of historical backgrounds and so on. But there is a danger that you use indigenous knowledge in a rather tokenistic way. Look at what we're doing, without really thinking, what is it you're trying to achieve? And I think also this kind of notion about what kind of knowledge is actually seen as legitimate in a thesis is one that I suspect doesn't get discussed very much by supervisors, but it seems to me it's something that they should be discussing and they should be thinking about that. I mean, doctoral knowledge obviously is multilingual. However, English is often the dominant means of publication. So if you want an academic job, then very often you're pushed into publishing in English. And there's also a lot of pressure in some countries. I mean, I've got a reference from Hugo Halter and Lee, which is about Hong Kong and China. But I think it applies to lots of European countries too, that the emphasis on publishing, even before you finish your thesis, is really, really strong in lots of countries. In one sense, that's good, but in another sense, it does put a lot of emphasis on publications and all the things that go with it, citations and impact factors and all these awful things. Whereas I think it's more important that you read the article to see if it's interesting, rather than to find out how many times some other article in the same journal has been cited. I also think there's too little attention is paid in doctoral research to the content and context of theses. It seems to me that's a really important issue, and that if you don't do that, if you don't think about what is the context of this thing that we're writing, what kind of content are we trying to put into it, then actually it misses out some of the doctoral process. But again, that's something that you have to have sophisticated supervisors aware of that. Okay, so how about challenges in relation to diversity? So, support for recruiting diverse doctoral researchers doesn't very often start early enough. So I think I said earlier that if you want to do things, you often have to do them. If you want inclusivity, you have to start that before they even apply to do a doctoral degree. And that having things that are open to everybody, and online advice can be really, really useful. I remember a few years ago when we were applying for some money to do with kind of increasing the number of people of colour that got into doctoral education, that we had a lot of discussion with our existing doctoral students who were people of colour. And one of the things that somebody said, who's now doing very well and is in her final year of her thesis, she said when she came to be interviewed for the scholarship that she got, she was asked, what is your theoretical framework? And she didn't know what one was. And you might think, well, if she didn't know what that was, then she doesn't deserve to be there. But actually, the fact that she's doing really well now suggests that it's not quite as straightforward as that, that depending on the kind of background you come from, the kind of institution you went to, there are all sorts of concepts which you just may not have come across. It doesn't mean you're not capable of using them. It just means that no one's actually supported you to understand how that fits together. And I think also that there's kind of insufficient post-enrollment consideration for doctoral researchers who are from underrepresented or minority groups or groups that aren't really used to doctoral study and for whom their families might think this is very strange, why do they want to do this? That you need to kind of continue that support all the way through. I mean, a lot of people say, well, let's do peer mentoring. But the problem is that sometimes the peers don't want to mentor. You know, you try and get people from a different year group, but not everybody wants to do that. So if you're going to offer that, you have to make it available to everybody, and that's not always easy to do. And also to avoid stereotyping people when you give support. Because they happen to have a particular condition or a particular cultural background doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be treated completely differently. It just means that if there are things that they need that other students do, then that's available, because the other doctoral researchers will also need different things. I think dropout and slow submissions are also, I mean, I've mentioned that earlier, but I think that is quite a problem for underrepresented groups, and I think they're probably much more worried about that than those who come from more confident backgrounds. I've talked about the mental health and well-being already. The lack of careers advice. I think there is a real problem in a lot of European universities and others, that the amount of career advice that doctoral researchers get is often related to academic jobs and not to other jobs. And that's a problem. And sometimes careers offices are not very keen on doing work with doctoral researchers. I mean, I certainly had that discussion in my institution a few years ago when they said, well, we do lots of things. And we said, yes, but you just send them to the same things you send the undergraduates to. Well, that's all they need. And we're saying, no, that's not the kind of jobs that they're going to go into in the main. So they actually need something that's tailored to what they want. Now, I don't think that's an unusual discussion. I'm sure that it's happened in other institutions too, but it just suggests that it's not straightforward and that people are not thinking broadly enough about that. And also, I think there's often a failure to fully support multilingualism and interculturality. So that's another problem. Another challenge is about supervision. I've talked about that a bit already, but I think there's likely to be quite a mixed response to diversity and inclusion. Not everybody thinks it's a good thing. I mean, a few years ago, we did a workshop with a collaborative doctoral scheme that works across different universities. And we were trying to get to issues around what they thought excellence meant, what they thought merit meant, what do you look for when you interview a doctoral researcher, what do you look for when you interview someone for a post. And we used Padlet, which is just a kind of it's an online tool for putting things on a kind of notice board. But because it was anonymous, we got people, we sent them a series of questions, and then we asked them to put anonymous comments up. And they got some fascinating discussions about why excellence was so important, and that you really couldn't just have anybody coming in. And so we were then able to have a discussion that I think we might not have been otherwise able to have, because those people would not have sat in a room and said those things. Or because they were anonymous statements, nobody knew who'd written them. And so that can be quite a useful device, but it doesn't work with everybody. I mean, I think there's a good chance that recruitment is often biased in the sense that people want to recruit doctoral researchers who they know something about. Maybe they know the person that taught them as an undergraduate. Maybe they know the institution. And so they're not really looking for a wide range of candidates. They're basically only looking at a very narrow band. And that's where you start to get a lack of inclusivity and diversity. And many supervisors, I think, believe that diversity is just about recruiting doctoral researchers, but it isn't just about that, and that's what I've been trying to show. There's a whole set of other things that you need to take into account in order to do that. And I think sometimes supervisory practices themselves need a good look, because some of the things that are set up with the best of intentions, like reading groups, for example. Now, a reading group can be inclusive or it can be very exclusive, depending on how it's advertised, who gets to do it, who chooses what they're going to read, where do you meet. All of those things could have quite a big effect on some people who feel that they're not included, or if they went that they wouldn't be welcome. I think there are also things like different frequency of how often the supervisor meets the doctoral researcher. If it's the same for all of their doctoral researchers, I think that's a good thing. But I suspect that's not always the case. That some may get, more informal hints about possible jobs or opportunities at conferences and things, opportunities to go abroad and so on. They may not be available to everybody. They should be, but they're not necessarily. So I think there's quite a lot that supervisors can do. But I think it's hard to work with supervisors because there's a lot of them. And I still feel torn between should you make training for supervisors compulsory, in which case you get people sitting there looking cross because they don't want to be there, they want to be somewhere more interesting, or do you make it voluntary, in which case you just get the people who are enthusiastic and probably thought about it already. And I think it's really difficult to decide which of those you use. Challenges in relation to diversity in higher education institutions themselves, I think often people don't look at that sufficiently. Now, some of these are not necessarily the fault of the institution, but for example, restrictive recruitment protocols about which applications are considered. In a lot of institutions, that's not done, that first decision, by academics at all. It's done by administrators who are just working to some kind of protocol that they've been given, sometimes not even got that from the academics. So I think the first thing is to kind of look at who makes the initial decision about which applications for doctoral research will actually be considered. Because I think in quite a lot of institutions the answer is that it's not done in a particularly good way, and it's not done by people who really understand what the degree is about. I think lack of imaginative and inclusive routes to a doctorate, like portfolios, I've talked about workshops, outreach with schools and colleges and the local area, things like contextual admissions, which is done a lot in undergraduate situations, but it's not done with doctoral researchers, where you take the context that they've been in and the kind of school they went to and the university that they've done their degree, you take that into account if it probably was not as good as it could have been. So you give them a place, but you actually take into account the sort of wider social and cultural and educational differences. So as I say, it's been done a lot with undergraduates, but I don't think it's been done very often with doctoral researchers. I think also there is a kind of belief somehow that coursework and the kinds of things that people say have done in their master's degree tells you whether they're going to be good at a doctorate. But there's someone called Barbara Lovitz who wrote a couple of books. It's about the American system, so it doesn't work quite so well in our system, but because they have to do coursework, as you probably know, before they proceed to the actual dissertation. But one of the things that she says was you can't necessarily predict that the fact that somebody did really well in coursework is necessarily going to turn into superb performance in writing a thesis, and that you have to look more broadly. And I think that's something we should remember. I think elite institutions and doctoral collaborators may be quite reluctant sometimes to do things that relate to diversity and inclusion because they fear that somehow they're not going to appear in some kind of league table or another, and I think that needs looking at. Very interesting article by Richard Budd recently on that in terms of social sciences and how it's seen and where it fits together, and what the challenges are about kind of how you do doctoral education versus how does your institution get into the top league tables, which they unfortunately are usually more interested in than mere doctoral researchers. I think a lot of regulations and processes are not always attuned to diversity and inclusion, and I think there's too little flexibility in doctoral education, particularly rigid infrastructures which don't really fit with creativity and innovation in what you do. I mean, there's also external factors which you can't really do that much about. So things like immigration and visa policies. We know that in some countries that even if you've got through an elaborate process of being selected, you turn up and you're refused a visa, or even if you've got a visa, sometimes you're sent home because you can't tell them every element of what you're going to do for the next 3 years. Well, who can do that anyway? I'm sure I couldn't have done that at that stage. But obviously institutions can't really do anything about that. There's clearly a kind of right-wing element that's moving against certain forms of diversity and inclusion. I mean, it doesn't happen so much in Europe, but it's present in Hungary, as we saw with the Central European University's departure to Vienna because it couldn't any longer get its gender studies courses validated. But I mean, if you look at what DeSantis is doing in Florida around equality steps and trying to not only get rid of new things in that, but actually to destroy what's already been done, then you can see where that might go. Also, I think countries where there are lots of centralised rules about doctoral education, they're good in one sense because they actually kind of make sure that everybody's got the same practice. But if they're restrictive in some way in terms of who can apply and what you can do, then that becomes a problem. And I also think there's a kind of view that equality and diversity and inclusion are a kind of somehow in tension with free speech. So there was an incident in 2022 when a minister in the UK, you know we get through them very quickly, so you know she was just passing through before she went to the next job, which was probably nothing to do with education. She sent a letter to all UK universities saying that you shouldn't be using accreditation schemes like gender and race and ethnicity because they clash with free speech. And the Vice-Chancellors wrote back and said, thanks very much, this has nothing to do with you, why don't you just go? Well, she did go, but I think it's frightening that someone should actually think that, though, because that's not at all helpful. So, I think the doctoral diversity dream is only partially realised. There's a lot more to be done. It is possible. I think we know a lot in some fields about what to do. I think we know a lot about what to do around race and ethnicity. Whether we actually do it and whether we have the support to do it is a different issue. But some of these other things I've talked about, like neurodiversity, I think we're a long way behind. And I also think we're a long way behind in terms of supervisors. So, I mean, I think diversity and inclusion do need to be closely linked, because otherwise we're not really going to have effective change at all. And I think that's still quite a long way off. Routes to diversity, as I've said, are not straightforward. And obviously the success depends partly on the perspectives of the participants involved, whether they're supervisors, whether they're applicants, whether they're administrators. Increasing diversity of doctoral researchers is a good starting point, but there are numerous other aspects of doctoral education which we also need to look at, and that's what I've tried to point out. And there are still country and region-specific barriers which are difficult to overcome, as well as a pressing need to relate doctoral education to the global south as well as the global north. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate being able to talk to you.